Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. Welcome. My name is Anna Weiss, and I work as a technical specialist here at NARUC. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for October's innovation webinar on equity and access in grid modernization. As you can see, we have a great lineup of speakers who will share their expertise on the subject. Before we get started, I have some housekeeping items to mention. You can ask questions throughout the webinar, even while the panelists are still presenting, by using the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen on the Zoom bar. We will address the questions after the presentations. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the NARUC website after about a week, so you are welcome to rewatch it or share it with your colleagues. And finally, we will share the slide deck with registered attendees through email shortly after the session. Before we hear from our speakers, I wanted to provide some background information on NARUC. Founded in 1889, NARUC is a nonprofit membership organization representing public service commissioners across all 50 states, including DC, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. Our mission is to serve the public interest by improving the quality and effectiveness of public utility regulation. We represent a membership of over 250 elected or appointed commissioners and over 1,000 commission staff on energy, telecom, water, and transportation regulatory issues. I specifically work for CPI, the Center for Partnerships and Innovation. CPI provides technical assistance to NARUC members. We do this in many ways, such as today's webinar, but also through trainings, working groups, and other activities. Our work is possible due to the support from the Department of Energy, so we would like to thank them for their support in our work today. CPI will host a number of upcoming in-person and virtual events. So on this slide, you can see what we have coming up, or you can visit the website listed below for additional information, and that link will also be in the chat as well. So at this time, I'd like to do a quick introduction of this session's moderator, the Honorable Harold Gray with the Delaware Public Service Commission. Commissioner Gray moved to Delaware from Washington, D.C. after receiving a chemistry degree from Howard University. He worked as a chemist and an engineer in a variety of research, development, and engineering and leadership roles. Commissioner Gray started as an SAP consulting company, Technodata America. As the founding president and CEO, he navigated Technodata's startup and successful growth with Fortune 100 clients throughout the world. He's a former vice president of resource development for the United Way and led statewide fundraising efforts. Commissioner Gray is also the former director of the Office of Economic Development for Wilmington, Delaware, and a past president of the Organization of PJM States. And now I will pass the mic to Commissioner Gray, who will introduce the topic and the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Can you hear me? Very good. Thank you very much, Anna, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. I want to encourage, as we move through our panel discussions today, that folks find their Q&A button at the bottom of their screen and launch any questions that the panelists may help us to answer at the end of our session. Today's webinar topic brings together perspectives from academia, advocacy, and utilities on upholding equity during grid modernization. Why is equity something that regulators should be thinking about, and how can it be practically applied to concrete collaboration between regulators and utilities? And what examples can we learn from? Today's speakers and panelists are as follows, and in this sequence. We invite and welcome Alexandra Klass, James Degnan Professor of Law at the University of Michigan Law School. She teaches and writes primarily in the areas of energy law, environmental law, natural resources law in 2022 and 23. She served in the Biden-Harris administration as Deputy General Counsel for Energy Efficiency and Clean Energy Demonstrations at the U.S. Department of Energy. Prior to her academic career, Professor Klass was a partner at Dorsey & Whitney, LLP in Minneapolis, where she specialized in environmental law and land use litigation. Welcome, Ms. Klass. We also have Kristol Sims, Kristol is the Vice President in Clean Energy Transition, Economic, Community, and Business Development for Ameren, Illinois, the state's largest combined natural gas and electric utility. She leads efforts in economic development, energy efficiency, and beneficial electrification, while driving grid transformation and the clean energy transition. Her work is driven by a deep passion for equity and environmental justice, ensuring all communities benefit from clean energy advancements. Welcome, Kristol. And finally, we have Will Kenworthy. Will is the Regulatory Director, Midwest for Vote Solar, where he has been shaping policies to transition to equitable clean energy since 2018. Will's responsibilities include guiding regulatory interventions and offering expert witness testimony in electric utility regulatory proceedings, including integrated resource planning, distribution, system planning, distributed generation compensation, and valuation, as well as rate cases. Vote Solar is a national nonprofit advocacy organization, but Will is based in Chicago and works throughout the Midwest. So welcome to our panelists. Welcome again to all of the attendees. At this point in the program, I'd like to turn over the mic and the systems to Alexandra Klass. Ms. Klass.
Thanks, Commissioner. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Is that a yes? Thumbs up. Excellent. I'm going to present on the topic of what I call reckoning with social policy and utility regulation. Next slide, please. So as part of that, I'm going to talk about energy justice. I'm going to talk about equity and grid modernization, and then some implications of recognizing what I and my co-author in a series of papers refer to as social policy in utility regulation. Next slide. And my talk today is going to be based on a couple of papers. One, and both of these are with Gabe Chan, who is a public policy professor at the University of Minnesota, where I also used to be a law professor before moving to Michigan law. So one is a paper we published a couple years ago called Regulating for Energy Justice. And now we have a follow-up one that is in progress that kind of broadens the scope of that paper, and that's called Reckoning with Social Policy and Utility Regulation. So my remarks today are really based on both of these papers. Next slide. So what do I mean by social policy? So at least for purposes of this paper, really what we're talking about in the context of utility regulation is social policy would include non-energy state and local socioeconomic concerns, so job creation, tax revenues, economic development, also past and current inequities regarding the provisioning of electricity service to communities and individuals. So some examples, and these are ones that we really focus on in the second paper, is energy justice. So this is about addressing past and current inequities regarding the provisioning of electricity services, and then also looking to the future. So potential future inequities relating to local socioeconomic concerns around the energy transition, often referred to as just transition concerns. So tax revenues, economic development, and jobs as a result of the clean energy transition. Next slide. So the issue that's raised with social policy and utility commissions is, of course, there's a long history of courts, of advocates, of commissioners themselves either warning or being warned not to make social policy, or similarly not to engage in social rate making. There's a series of cases we talk about in our first paper from the 1980s and the 1990s. Social policies for the legislature, not for utility commissions. So our question really here is, what is the role of the legislature, of state commissions, and of courts in addressing social policy issues? Because at least our thesis is this is an issue for legislatures, but it's also a central issue for commissions, and it's always been a central issue for commissions. Next slide. Now, there's some challenges to addressing social policy in utility regulation. There's a lot of scientific and economic and technocratic processes in these proceedings. So oftentimes social policy is hidden within and behind those processes. This comes up in cost causation issues where they're sort of applied inconsistently. Cross-subsidization, it exists everywhere, but it's managed selectively, and it's also often behind this veil of these technocratic processes. Rates are based often on primarily on costs, not necessarily benefits, which can be a problem. And also there's just no fixed scope of authority for the commission mandate to set just and reasonable rates to promote the public interest. What does that mean? And who sets the parameters of what that means? Next slide. So we go through some examples before we get to energy justice and just transition in the second paper. And we talk about these in the first paper as well. So low income rates, starting in the 1970s and in the 1980s, oftentimes legislatures will authorize low income rates. But in cases in states where legislatures have been silent, either utilities or advocates would ask commissions to set low income rates. And oftentimes courts would invalidate those. That this was social policy, and the commission is not empowered to act on the basis of social policy. You can't subsidize one consumer group for another. You need to wait for the legislature. This is what happened in Utah, although in that case, the court left open another attempt by the commission to sort of justify actually creating a senior citizen rate in that case. And then they did that. In 2000, there was additional fact finding. The commission authorized similar low income rates based on energy burden and lower costs for all ratepayers in that circumstance. And there's a great quote from that decision where the commission says, examples abound to demonstrate that one person's improper social welfare program is another person's legitimate regulation of utilities in the public interest. So social policy or social welfare is often in the eye of the beholder and advocates. Next slide. Compare this now to economic development rates, which utilities have approved for a long time. So we give some examples from Kentucky and from other states, looking at commissions approving discounted rates, even when there's not specific legislative authority to do so, saying these are reasonable preferences that are allowed. There's lots of states that have done this, and they've done this not just with statutory authorization, but under their own just and reasonable rate-making authority based on the overall benefits to the system. So one of our takeaways from this comparison is that economic development rates, of course, also implicate social policy, and they're based on the social policy of bringing more jobs and economic prosperity to a community, but they're often not recognized as social policy in a way that would invalidate those rates in a way that we saw in the low income rate situation. We see the two types as actually being quite similar. Next slide. So now let's move to energy justice and see how this issue plays out in the energy justice context. So I provide a definition of energy justice here from the Institute of Energy Justice that a lot of people use. Next slide. And there's many people refer to the four tenets of energy justice. So this is kind of the who, the how, the what, and the why of energy justice. Recognitional justice, procedural justice, distributional justice, and restorative justice, with a definition of kind of what each of these principles are attempting to do. Next slide. So my co-author, Gabe Chan, has had some great research assistants that put together a whole data set of looking at utility regulatory proceedings around the country where commissions and advocates are engaging with energy justice. Hopefully we can extend this data set out a bit. Gabe's wife just had a baby last week, so he is on parental leave for a bit, so I gotta wait till he comes back, but hoping to get the rest of 2023 and 2024. But you can see that just energy justice was not an issue that was raised even just a few years ago. You see, a steady increase starting in like 2014, 2015, and then a real acceleration 2020, 2021, 2022, as more advocates and more commissions are addressing how to deal with energy justice in a whole range of utility proceedings. Next slide. This shows the data set on a map and shows kind of the concentration of states in which this is happening. One map is proceedings in which just the parties are raising energy justice, which is quite a lot, and then a smaller subset where the commission orders are addressing energy justice as well. Next slide. And this shows the types of regulatory proceedings where commissions are engaging with energy justice. So you see a lot of rate cases, resource planning decisions, distributed energy, resource issues, distribution plan and grid modernization, our topic for today, a certificate of need, energy efficiency, and then sort of a whole host of others. So they're really not concentrated in just one type of utility proceeding. Next slide. So we sort of divide states into two categories. Some states are, the legislature is now mandating that commissions consider either equity or energy justice in rate making or in their other proceedings. So we list those states here and give some example language from Colorado as an example of some of this legislation. So requiring utilities to provide 40% of funds for renewable energy and retail distributed generation programs to low-income customers and disproportionately impacted communities, specifically to address historical equity issues concerning access by low-income customers to renewable energy and retail distributed generation programs. Each state statute is a little bit different. Next slide. So an example of a commission dealing with energy justice in the face of a statutory mandate is Washington. So in that case, the legislature enacted a statute that expanded the commission's public interest standard to include the equitable distribution of energy benefits and reduction of burdens to vulnerable populations and highly impacted communities. So what did the commission do with that? It actually used that equitable distribution language to specifically adopt the four core tenets of energy justice, the ones that I had on the earlier slide, to bring equity into the context of utility rate making. So that quote is from the commission order. And then in a later order, the commission built on that by approving a utility proposal to apply equity metrics in performance measures and in outcomes, tracking average energy burdens of customers over time, and then also setting a 6% threshold for energy burden concerns. Next slide. So Minnesota is an example where there isn't a statutory mandate to specifically address equity or energy justice. So in a 2023 decision by the commission relied on its just and reasonable rate-making authority to require utilities to expressly incorporate those same energy justice tenets into future rate-making proceedings in parallel with the already existing equity stakeholder advisory group. One of the arguments that Xcel Energy made in that proceeding, they said, yes, energy justice is important, but we don't think it should be part of rate making. It should be addressed exclusively through that ESAG proceeding. Next slide. So then Xcel came forward with a really innovative proposal from that ESAG proceeding, proposing a 2-year pilot project to bring equity into rate making, to do electricity bill credits, and using funds from the settlement over Yucca Mountain to fund that. Next slide. What was most interesting to Gabe and myself about this analysis is that Xcel included in its proposal a legal analysis of why this was not unreasonably preferential, prejudicial, or discriminatory rates. and said, basically, this is addressing past discrimination, not necessarily by Excel, but due to systemic and long-term societal inequities that have led to a lot of the problems that we see today. And so this is why they thought it was a reasonable proposal. The commission still needs to act on that. So I think
Dr.
I'll leave
Klass?
it there. Yep, I think I'll leave
Okay,
it there, and we'll move on to the next speaker and look forward to questions at the end.
thank you for that input. It's been very informative as a commissioner as well. And we'll come back to some Q&A at the end of the session. At this juncture, I'd like to transition to our next panelist, Kristol Sims from Ameren. Kristol, are you ready? I don't hear Kristol at the moment. Are you on mute? And so in the interest of time, I'll ask the technology folks in the background if they can stage the presentation from Will Kenworthy. We'll move forward with Will's presentation, and then we will come back to Kristol after Will is completed. Will, are you ready?
I am.
Thank you very much. You've got the floor.
Thank you, Commissioner Gray. And while we're waiting for the slides to come up, I'll just get started. Good afternoon. My name is Will Kenworthy. I'm the Senior Regulatory Director for the Midwest with Vote Solar. And today I'll be discussing, you can go to the next slide, Jessica. Today I'll be discussing grid equity from my perspective as an intervener working to advance equitable clean energy transition, what it means for modernizing our energy systems, and focusing on lessons learned from recent regulatory activity where I work in the Midwest. Let's start by defining grid equity. At its core, as we at Vote Solar and our partners around the country use it, grid equity is about ensuring the fair distribution of both costs and benefits of grid modernization. Equity means that all customer segments, especially low-income and marginalized communities, must have access to clean energy technologies, more reliable electricity, and affordable energy burden. I think of grid equity as a subset of energy justice that focuses on the distribution grid, electrification, and grid modernization. Next slide, please, Jessica. This leads us to the foundational question that underpins grid equity. Do customers in disadvantaged communities have the same reliability and access to the benefits of grid modernization and electrification as those in wealthier communities? With the right analytical approach and access to granular customer reliability data, we can now assess grid equity across multiple dimensions of utility performance. This is a key step in addressing long-standing inequities. To paraphrase management guru Peter Drucker, you can't manage what you can't measure. Next slide, please, Jessica. Now let's turn to some stories, success stories, and lessons learned from the Midwest, particularly Minnesota, Michigan, Illinois. One common thread across these states is that grid equity is becoming an integral to the regulatory framework. In Minnesota, the MPUC has found that grid equity is part of the just and reasonable standard for utilities, which ensures that utility investments are evaluated not just on technical merit, but also on their equity impacts. Michigan is incorporating energy justice, environmental justice analysis into grid planning and rate cases. And in Illinois, through the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, it's fundamentally reshaping its utility regulations to prioritize equity. Next slide, please. In Minnesota, the state's efforts to address grid equity span across multiple dockets. Last year, the MPUC found that the tenets of energy justice are part of what the Commission considers in evaluating the justness and reasonableness of the utilities application. In Excel's last IRP, the Commission also ordered the formation of a separate equity stakeholder advisory group to ensure that underrepresented voices are included in decision-making. Importantly, Minnesota's work is underpinned by data. A University of Minnesota study authored by Gabe Chan, who Alexandra just referred to, has demonstrated that significant correlation exists between race, income, and utility disconnections, highlighting the need for policymakers to address these disparities. Excel also did a similar analysis and came to similar but less strong findings. Next slide, please. Michigan is another leader in this area. The Michigan Public Service Commission has recently clearly recognized the need for equity to be embedded in both safety and reliability. In fact, their recent September 2024 order in the distribution planning docket or underscores the need for alternative analysis in grid investments and emphasizes the importance of equity in planning. Next slide, please. Illinois, with the enactment of the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act in 2021, has taken a transformative approach to grid equity. CEJA fundamentally reshaped how the state regulates its distribution utilities by embedding equity considerations into multi-year grid plans and rate cases. This includes explicit performance metrics focused on reliability, grid access, and the benefits flowing to disadvantaged communities. The major shift here is that Illinois now evaluates utility performance through a lens that prioritizes equitable outcomes, particularly for underserved communities. And Kristol Sims will talk a lot about this in the next presentation. Next slide, please. So what policy tools can we use to advance grid equity? A few key ones include equity benefits analysis or distributional equity analysis, which helps ensure that the costs and benefits of grid investments are fairly distributed. Performance metrics that focus on reliability, grid access, and benefits from grid modernization are also critical. Utility programs, such as those providing affordability assistance, supporting community solar, and promoting distributed energy resources are important to include as well. As we have advocated in several different forums, DER present a unique opportunity to address affordability, resilience, and community wealth building in a targeted and cost-effective way, especially if you can effectively leverage available federal resources for low-income solar. Next slide, please. As we look ahead, it's clear that equity must be a foundational element of grid modernization efforts. We have the tools and the data now at the census tract level in many cases, and underpinning much of the analysis in the three examples I gave, to make sure that no community is left behind in the clean energy transition. The path forward requires ongoing collaboration between regulators, utilities, and communities. Utilities need to incorporate equity into their core investment and planning processes, and commissions must hold them accountable to ensure that performance reflects equitable outcomes. Ultimately, sustained effort and attention across multiple dockets and time is critical to making sure that equity remains a priority. Next slide, please. In conclusion, grid equity is not just about modernizing our grid. It's about ensuring that the benefits of this transition are shared by all. By leveraging new data, such as census tract level reliability metrics, and focusing on equity from a policy and regulatory perspective, we can make significant strides toward a more just and reliable energy future. Thank you, and I'll be happy to take any questions when the time comes.
Thank you very much, Will, for that presentation. I want to remind all of the attendees that the Q&A box is available should you have questions for Dr. Klass or for Will. And at this juncture, we're going to try and turn back again to Kristol Sims. I did reach her during our break or during the last session. She's having or had some connectivity issues, but I think I can see her on the screen. Kristol, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Commissioner. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. I'd like to turn the floor to you, please.
Thank you. And I apologize for the technology issue. I am on my cell phone now, which seems to be going okay. And so I'll jump right in. And as the previous panelists spoke about, of course, equity in the grid planning and utility planning process is evolving. And so I'm going to cover some of the ways that it's evolved in Illinois and some of the ways that the utility, Ameren, Illinois, has moved forward with that evolution. If we could slip to the next slide. This is just a background slide about who I am. I won't cover this too much, but I lead our energy efficiency, our electrification, our grid planning, and our economic development team. And so my last slide talks about how that all comes together. But as a utility, everything that we're doing is becoming a lot more integrated and connected. And we are standing up teams that are more integrated and connected and working together. Next slide. Just a little bit of background on Ameren, Illinois. For context, we are the electric and gas dual fuel utility that serves most of the state of Illinois geographically, south of the Chicagoland area. We serve just over 1.2 million electric customers and over 800,000 natural gas customers. We serve a very broad geographic area, so we have both urban and rural communities within our service territory that we serve with their energy needs. Next slide, please. So as the other panelists have covered already today, the planning process has evolved significantly for utilities and in the regulated space for energy. Over the past 2 decades, we've seen the planning process go from utilities and the regulators who are overseeing their planning efforts, focusing on just one-way power flows with no visibility beyond the substation, evolving to more grid modernization with more technology on the grid, different expectations from customers and regulators and utilities as to how the grid will operate, reliability and resiliency being a significant focus, to the next step of including distributed energy resources, now incorporating to power flow to the grid and the impacts of that on the planning process, to where we are currently, which is a process where there's many more system attributes that are incorporated into the planning process. So equity is one of those attributes. Additional attributes are cost effectiveness, affordability, and also stakeholder input. The utilities are taking in and incorporating and considering input from a variety of stakeholders across the landscape. And then finally, we think the next step is a much more integrated planning process, which incorporates all those attributes and starts to move more towards a dual fuel, electric and gas view of the planning process. And so now I'll break down how equity has impacted the planning process in Illinois a little bit on the next few slides. Next slide. So in Illinois, CEJA, the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, which Will mentioned, did sort of launch us forward in terms of considering or incorporating equity into the planning process. And there's been a little bit of a storied road for us to get to where we are today, but right now we are responding to a commission directive and an order from last year, which required the utility to demonstrate how 40% of the benefits from our grid plan will benefit equity investment eligible communities, which in Illinois includes environmental justice communities as well as low income communities. And so we are specifically looking at what the benefits are that are being produced, and then how much of those benefits are going to those communities. And we developed an equity framework, which I'll cover in the next few slides. Next slide. So in order to develop our equity framework, we really broke it down into 5 main processes. First, we identify which investments are in scope in terms of this equity framework, meaning which of the investments within our grid plan fall into the category of either grid modernization investments or investments that support our performance metrics. The next step was to quantify what the benefits are from those investments. So not every dollar is calculated as a benefit, but if they do benefit the communities, then we are quantifying those. The third step was to identify who are the communities that we want to serve, and I'll cover that on the next slide, or the ones that will fall into the category of the benefits being calculated. And then we allocated those investments, those benefits that were quantified to those communities. And the final step was to produce a calculation. So we'll step through that process in the next couple slides. So once we identify which investments were in scope or out of scope, and then quantify the benefits, then we identify what the communities are. And so these communities, we look to, in order to identify what the communities are, we first looked at who are all of the AIC retail customers. And then we determined what percentage of those retail customers are also in equity investment eligible communities. So this is a way for us to focus in on which of the communities fall into the calculation that we are attempting to produce. And we determined that 19% of our total retail customers fall into the EIEC category. But then there also is another subcategory of low income customers. They don't completely overlap. There is a significant amount of overlap. So then we determined what percentage of our customer base are also low-income customers, and then which ones are fall into the environmental justice community separately. And the reason that we had to do these all these different calculations is that CJ had a different definition in different parts of the law of who the benefits would go to. Sometimes it said environmental justice, sometimes it said EIEC, and sometimes it said low income. In order for us to capture all of that, we had to break down our customer base in this way. And we landed on a total of 34% of our customers fall into one of these categories. So the next slide. So once we knew what the communities are that we wanted to serve, then we were able to use our allocation model to look at the types of investments that are in the grid plan, and then use that to map out a way to quantify those investments. So the types of investments fall into three main categories. Either they're targeted, which means they are designed to serve certain communities, or they're geographic, which means they are a specific asset that serves a geographic area on the grid, or they are general, which means they serve a large swath or the grid in general. Once we knew which category they fell into, then we were able to determine if they were grid modernization benefits or performance metrics benefits, and then allocate them to the communities that we defined in the previous step. Once we did all of those steps, then we were able to produce a calculation of how much of the benefits from those investments were going to the communities that we wanted to serve, these equity investment eligible communities. So I know this is a lot, but if we flip to the next slide, I can talk about the outcome. So once we step through our allocation model, using that formula that I just laid out, then we were able to determine that in total, 51% of our grid plan investments are going to either an equity investment eligible community, environmental justice, or low income community. But then we also broke it down in each of those categories to determine that 58% of the benefits for investments that were meant to serve our performance metrics were going to those communities, and that 52% of them were going to grid modernization. In all fairness, there are other parties within the docket who had different allocation processes to determine how much of the benefits were going to these communities. And they reached different calculations, which ranged from 26% up to the 58% calculation that we reached. And so within our docket, it's all very transparent in terms of how we got there. But I think the most important thing is that the parties, for the most part, agreed that this is a process that needs to evolve. It needs a significant amount of tracking and reporting, and we need to reach consensus over time as to what the benefits are, how it'll be calculated and allocated to these communities. And so Ameren, Illinois has committed to doing that. And I expect that the Illinois Commerce Commission will initiate workshops in the next year in order to facilitate that process. So the next slide. So in summary, I do have a few more slides to talk about some of the programs that we are offering, but I wanted to make sure that I highlight that this is very complicated. Obviously, you can hear from the way that I've covered this and the other panelists that there is so much involved. But at the end of the day, as a person of color, as a person who cares a lot about environmental justice, this is the work that really needs to get done. And so we are a utility, and I know that other stakeholders in Illinois are very committed to figuring this out. And I'll talk about some of the ways that we figured this out. So the first thing I wanted to highlight on the next slide is our market development initiative, which we've been offering a market development initiative for energy efficiency since 2018. And we are proposing to expand this to all of the clean energy transition. And what it really does is focus on expanding diversity in jobs, the people who are employed in the clean energy industry. It focuses on expanding opportunities for women and minority-owned businesses who are offering services and products within the clean energy transition or the clean energy industry. And then finally, it supports growing customer knowledge and participation in our programs. Like demand response would be an example. Also, programs like our energy efficiency or beneficial electrification programs would also be examples. We have a budget allocated in order to be able to offer these programs, and we expect to work very closely with grassroots community organizations as well as stakeholders in order to make sure that these programs are successful. The next slide, please. So our market development initiative will focus on the utility being a connector of many different components of the clean energy transition. So when you think about a new electric vehicle charging program, we want to help make sure that the people who are servicing those chargers or installing those chargers are representative of the communities that we serve. And so while Ameren will not be an employer of those companies, we will, or those job seekers in those companies, we would like to help build a network of diverse contractors and contractors who are committed to hiring a diverse workforce. And then also, as we develop training programs or support funding for training programs, that we support programs that focus on the clean energy transition as well. We also are focused on STEM education for students, scholarships, internships, and other programs like that. Next slide, please.
Kristol, this is
Yes.
Commissioner Gray. You can hear me?
Yes.
I wanted to intervene, and I apologize because we do have a couple of questions we want to get to as well. A very quick question for you before you wrap up your presentation. I noted in the Q&A section, one of the attendees wants to know the acronym EIEC. They missed it if you didn't, or you may not have described what that means.
Thank you, Commissioner. Yes, EIEC comes from the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, CEJA, and it stands for Equitable Investment Eligible Communities. And it's a combination of environmental justice communities and then reinvestment communities that were defined in the law. And I will conclude my presentation here with this slide that just talks about how it all comes together and it all matters together. Affordability, electrification, all of the things that we're trying to do with the clean energy transition are interconnected. And I think that we need to all work together to find solutions that serve these communities because the impact can be great.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Kristol. I appreciate that presentation on behalf of the attendees as well. At this juncture, we're going to move into a Q&A segment. And I don't know if any of the panelists has resonated with a specific question that they may have monitored from the Q&A. I will give you 30 seconds to weigh in, unmute, and respond to anything that seems to have fallen within your lane.
Can you hear me? I can address the question about just sort of summarizing key takeaways pretty briefly. So, again, these are sort of a series of academic papers, so they're on kind of a higher conceptual level than some of the other presentations. But, we give a lot of examples there. And so some of the takeaways would be just to recognize that commissions have always been social policymakers. Oftentimes in the proceedings that we review in these articles, commissions should not be engaged in social policy. And we see that quote again and again and again, either by courts or by others. But like commissions have always been, social policy has always been really important. So what do we do with that? One is to be just more transparent around what social policies are at issue, how they intersect with rate making, with integrated resource planning, with grid modernization decisions, so that stakeholders and others really know what is at stake and can respond to that. Now, in order for that to be effective, we think there needs to be more financial support for interveners in regulatory proceedings so they can actually engage. And I also think it's important to recognize the unique forum that commissions provide in terms of being able to collect evidence, make decisions, and be in this sort of ongoing back and forth with courts and with state legislatures that I think is much more dynamic than what you see like with FERC and Congress. You see a lot more legislatures responding to commissions, commissions responding to legislatures, and the courts in that mix as well. So I think recognizing this role of social policy in commission decisions just provides a really important framing for stakeholders. And that recognizing state commissions are kind of these action situations where diverse stakeholders can form coalitions, develop deep knowledge, invest in networks, and participate over long periods of time. And we're really starting to see that. We're seeing new advocacy groups forming around the country to join longtime advocates and raising the profile of state commission work. I think that's good, really for everyone. I also think that if state commissions are recognized as legitimate makers of social policy alongside legislatures, the courts might be able to give commissions more deference to allow them to make that policy and maybe allow the legislature to correct, not always the courts. That can be a double-edged sword if you don't like the policy, but I think actually engaging with that is really, really important. That's those are kind of the main takeaways from the papers and from the presentation.
Excellent, very informative. Thank you. And I noticed that Kristol's hand is up. Kristol, you have the floor.
Thank you, Commissioner. Yes, and I will kind of add on to the end of what Alexandra said, just in terms of a key summary or takeaway from my perspective is that it is complicated, but that as an executive of a utility or representative of a utility in the Midwest, that utilities should be seen as a potential solution finder, solution builder. We have interconnectedness with the communities that we serve. We in general live here. Many of us grew up here, have families. These are our church members, our parishioners and neighbors. And we are also committed to seeing these communities thrive and equity. And I think that utilities should be given an opportunity to be a part of the solution builders. And I think Illinois serves as a great example. I did want to cover one of the questions in the Q&A, which was how can we reconcile equity and system planning when most of the large percentage of transmission and generation growth is driven by large customers? And I think this is a wonderful, very timely question because there is a lot of discussion right now around data centers and large amount of growth on the system. I think that one of the narratives and stories that's not being told is there's an enormous amount of benefit, economic benefit for the communities that will be not just served by these developments in technology, but also that can help bring it forward in terms of being the workforce. So some data centers oftentimes are looked at as having a small amount of jobs. There may be 100 to 200 jobs of people who badge into that facility in 5 years. But in the next 5 to 7 years, in order to build those data centers, that can be over 1,000 very good paying construction jobs. And this is transformational income and revenue for these communities where these data centers are sited. So I think that is inappropriate to look at these larger customers as some type of like weighing down of the grid. They will require a significant amount of energy, but we do have time in order to be able to build a system and to transform the system to be able to meet those needs. And the economic benefit is enormous. And then also I'll say that the technology advancements that are taking place are global in nature. So this is about global competitiveness, not just a state situation. So we have to think about the fact that technology and the need for information is growing. That need will be met. We want our communities to benefit from the economic advancements of meeting that need. And I think that I'm advocating for Illinois, but any utility economic development person will advocate, I think, for their state to be competitive. And I think that customers will ultimately benefit from an affordability perspective too, because of the benefits and that will result from building out the system to meet those energy needs.
Excellent points, Kristol. I completely agree with you. I do see Will's hand up, and before I yield the floor for Will, I'm just going to ask Alexandra, would you mind putting your contact information, please, in the chat box? Because I don't know that we got to that slide in your presentation. Will, your hand is up. You have the floor.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up on Kristol's point on, how data centers are going to impact the system. And I'd start by just dividing it into two questions, really, to start with. One of them is, there's a question of energy adequacy and the impact on the energy supply. which I think needs to be figured out. There was in the Excel Minnesota IRP this year, they did a scenario based on their preferred portfolio where they looked at the impacts of adding 2.5 gigawatts of demand was, and there was some interesting results from that. It hasn't been fully fleshed out yet, but there's some interesting impact on that. But the other thing is that, from a distribution system planning perspective, it's all going to come down, the cost of interconnecting rate, or the cost of interconnecting these large new loads is going to all come down to how costs are allocated and how the rates are designed for those customers, whether or not they're paying their fair share, and whether or not they're having any impact on residential and smaller commercial customers. So, right, it will all depend on how you allocate those costs as to whether or not you could design a system and allocate the costs in such a way that it has no impact on residential customers. But under existing most cost allocation under the way most states do it, there will be some impact on residential customers, and so you got to figure out whether or not you're going to try to change it to address that, or just accept that.
Excellent. Thank you, Will. I want to go to one question that I noted in the Q&A box, and I think, Kristol, you may have touched closest on the response to this. But the questioner says, what's the general process for deciding the metrics and policies for grid equity? What kind of work has to go into constructing them? And how do we find the specific amounts to give to different communities?
Sure, I can take the first shot at that. So in Illinois, the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act did set the metric at 40%, or the utility supporting 40% of the benefits going to specific communities, and those communities were identified. So that, I think, in a way made it a little bit easier, but it didn't make it black and white, because there is still some room for interpretation around how you allocate, or what types of programs are sufficiently allocated to those communities. I think I would say, to kind of keep it brief, I think it's incumbent upon the different commissioners, stakeholders, and the utilities to work together to reach some common sense agreement as to who the communities are. I think that while it may not be black and white, it will not be hard to know which communities have been disadvantaged within the service area, which have not sort of seen the benefits of technology advancements, economic advancements, and which ones need the extra effort to analyze the benefits that they are receiving from these types of programs. And then I think that in terms of what the benefits are and the metrics, I think that can be very broad, because the metrics range from better air quality, access to different environmental resources, all the way to what I really am a strong advocate for, which is life-changing wealth opportunities, like jobs and business opportunities and economic growth. And so all of those benefits, to me, mean something, and we need to understand what those benefits are and find a good way to calculate and allocate those.
Great. Did I note
Point?
Alexandra's hand?
Yeah, I
Yes.
just want to build on what Kristol said. She raises a really good point that's sort of consistent with something I had said earlier about it really matters whether, like, the legislature has acted or they haven't. So in Illinois, Illinois has set some specific metrics, not all of them, the legislature has, and decided sort of how to do the calculations of which to some extent, of sort of which types of ratepayers are in, which ones are not. And so you can use that as a guide. There's still a lot more to do. In a state where the legislature hasn't acted, then in some ways there's more creativity, which there's positives and negatives to that. But then there's it's really incumbent on the utilities, on stakeholders, on being actively engaged in the process to come up with metrics, either borrowing from good examples of other states, whether it's legislative or other regulatory proceedings, and really having those advocacy groups who are working across states as well, like Will and others are doing, so they can bring maybe some good ideas from something that's happening in Minnesota or Illinois to Michigan and vice versa. And I think having that that knowledge and expertise in bringing that through the stakeholder groups is really, really important, and providing the ability to learn from these different regulatory proceedings.
Great points. Will, I see your hand.
Yeah,
You have the
yeah, I
floor.
wanted to just chime in on this one also. And I agree, like, that when it comes to, you know, where the legislature has made it easy and laid out equity metrics that you can work to, it actually makes it easy. But, you know, I would also say that there's a principle that I articulated at the beginning of my presentation, that you know, you can also just look at whether customers in environmental justice communities, however you define them, have the same service as customers in wealthier communities. And one of the things that the analysis that Gabe Chan did, and that one of my colleagues has done in a couple cases where we've intervened in, is that there's some interesting dynamics in that if you look system-wide, you find that so let me just back up and say that, you know, I'm very proud to work in Illinois, Michigan, and Minnesota, where they actually have done the work to identify customers by census tract. And so you can actually measure reliability by census tract. And what you see is that in a lot of cases, customers in disadvantaged communities tend to have equal or better reliability on a system-wide basis. But if you look at comparable systems, you see that there might be some discrepancies there. And that's sort of what the analysis that Gabe Chan has led has sort of revealed. And so you can just do sort of comparison there. And then the last thing I would say is that commissions can latch onto that, because I haven't yet to run into anyone in any community, in any proceeding where we've been in, where we've raised this topic, that everyone should have equitable, you know, the same quality of service, regardless of where you live. And so measuring that and figuring out whether or not that equity exists is the challenge, though.
Excellent points. Kristol, I see your hand, but I'm afraid we're probably close to the top of the hour. I'd like to spend about 30 seconds just to share some feedback from my perspective. As a state commissioner in Delaware for 10 years, the subject matter is very close to my heart, and it's not an easy set of challenges to resolve. I think Kristol, presented a slide that says it's complicated in some ways. And Alexandra, I think you pointed out adeptly that, you know, it could be the legislature, it could be the courts, it could be the commissions, and each of us in different states has our own statutory authority defined by the laws and the legislation written within our own jurisdictions. Some of us try to reach beyond those statutory authorities and get slapped back by the courts. But it's helpful to understand, as well as to benchmark best practices that have been developed in other jurisdictions. And I certainly appreciate the value of going through a panel discussion such as this. And I want to thank each of the panelists, Kristol, Will, Alexandra. I want to thank the support folks over at NARUC who helped put this together. And I want to thank the attendees who have given their time to engage. The last thing I'll say is that, you know, sometimes these challenges require some creativity to actually resolve. And I always say that creativity is a stone thrown uphill against the downward rush of habit. So we have to think about how to creatively address some of these problems and issues, but I'm encouraged that there are very smart folks thinking about it and are able to inform us to make the right decisions moving forward. I thank you again very much, everyone, for joining us. Have a very pleasant evening.